Hi everyone, if you're just starting your watercolour journey, one technique you need to learn is how to paint a basic flat wash. Today I'm going to show you how to paint one. I'll give you a few exercises that you can use to practice, and I'll show you a few things that can go wrong with them. In watercolour, basically there are three types of washes: a flat wash, a graded wash, and a variegated wash. Now it's important for you to learn how to do these washes so that you can build on them later. Now, as I said, in this video I'm just going to focus on the flat wash. Now, learning how to paint a flat wash correctly will help you understand how watercolour behaves when you put it on the paper. When you paint a flat wash, your aim is to try to get the wash consistent in tone and colour from the top to the bottom of whatever it is you're painting. Now, it's not easy to do when you first start, and you need to practice it over and over until you begin to understand what's happening with the paint, the water, and the paper. Pay attention to how much water you have on your brush. Pay attention to how much water you have on your paper, and watch the paint as it dries. What is it doing? Be observant. So the first thing to take into consideration is your paper. You'll have more success if you use 100% cotton paper as opposed to pulp paper. I use arch paper, and I have from the very first time I started painting in watercolour. I bought the little A5 pads and I painted with those for a while. When I gained more confidence, I moved up to the A4 size paper and then eventually onto the A3 sized paper. And then when I was really confident, I started using full sheets of watercolour paper. So the paper is important. Another thing that's important is your brush. You need to choose the size of your brush wisely, because if you don't, it can lead to problems. You can use a flat brush or a round brush. I'll be using round brushes today because I don't often use flats. Now, the size of the brush you use will be determined by the size of the area that you want to paint. And a good rule of thumb is to use the biggest brush that you're comfortable with. To demonstrate, I'm using some Arches cold pressed paper. Now, I always stretch watercolour paper 300 GSM in weight and under before I paint on it. But today I'm going to be lazy and I'm just going to tape it to my board. I've got some Winsor Newton permanent rose here that I've mixed with some water. And you need to make sure you have enough paint ready to complete your wash. You don't want to run out of paint halfway through painting your wash and find you have to mix up some more. My paper is ready, my board is tilted, and my paint is ready. I'm going to use a Vinci Maestro No. 8 round brush to paint my flat wash. Now paint the paint on the paper from left to right, and then I'll reload my brush. And I'll lay in another stroke, and then I'll just go back and forth across the paper like that. I reload the brush when I need to, and I keep moving that bead of paint down the paper. I paint as quickly as I can because I don't want that paint to dry. And my brush always touches the bottom of the previous brush stroke. Now, don't think that there's enough paint on the paper. You have to keep reloading your brush to maintain that bead of paint at the bottom. So if that bead of paint there at the bottom starts to disappear, you need to reload your brush and get some more paint on there. Now, when I get to the bottom, I need to take the paint out of my brush and most, but not all of the moisture. And then I can use my brush like it's a sponge, and I can soak up that excess bead of paint that's there at the bottom. So it just sucks the paint back up into the brush. So I don't need that extra paint there. So practice that exercise as many times as you need to. You don't need to paint a full sheet of paper if you don't want to. You can draw up some different sized squares and rectangles on your paper and paint flat washes inside them. Put your board on an angle and get enough paint on your brush so that that bead of excess paint pools at the bottom of your brush stroke. Then take that excess moisture out of your brush and use it to sop up that bead of paint. Now, let me show you what happens if you don't absorb that bead of paint at the bottom of your wash. So I'll do the same thing here. I've got a new piece of paper on my board, and my board is on an angle, just like it was. I paint the strokes back and forth across my paper, just like I did. You can see that bead of paint forming at the bottom of my strokes. This time, I'm not going to soak it up with my brush. I'm just going to leave it sitting there. And I'll put this on time lapse so you can see what happens to the paint. So I've got it on time lapse now. And what will happen is the top half of the shape will dry quicker than the bottom half. And as it dries, the wet puddle of paint will flow into the drier area and it creates a watercolour bloom. So here you can see how that watercolour bloom has formed across the top of the wash there. Okay, so that's one thing that can go wrong. Another problem you might have is you might use a brush that's too small for the size of the area that you're painting. Now remember I said earlier that you need to choose your brush wisely. Now if your brush is too small, you'll struggle to lay the paint on the paper and you'll end up with a patchy mess. I'll quickly draw a rectangle here. Now instead of using the number 8 brush that I used before, so this one, I'll use my little number 3 instead to paint that rectangle shape in. Now I'll do the same thing. I'll paint the paint on horizontally across the paper, just like I did before with the larger brush. Now because this brush is smaller, it doesn't hold as much water and as much paint, and it just doesn't cover the area very quickly. I'm also not getting that big bead of wet paint at the bottom of my strokes either. I'm finding the brush is dragging on the paper as well. It's more of a struggle for me to put the paint down. It's just not flowing off my brush the way it did with the larger brush. Now as I said, you don't have to use round brushes to paint washes. You can use flat brushes as well. I don't very often use flat brushes and I don't have very many of them. I will be needing to buy some because I want to start painting some landscapes. So you can see I'm really struggling with this little brush in this large shape. It's just not big enough to cover the area. Okay, so I'm at the bottom now and I've finally got a bit of a bead of paint in the bottom corner here. So I'm just going to sop that up with my damp brush and then I'll see how this shape dries. Okay, so now that it's dry, you can see that it's quite patchy looking. So when you compare it to my first shape that I painted with the larger brush, you can see that it's really patchy and it's not evenly covered with paint the way that first shape is. You can paint a flat wash on dry paper like I showed you, or you can paint on damp paper. Now I have a video about the different stages of paper wetness, so make sure you have a look at that if you need to. Personally, I prefer to paint a wash on damp paper, particularly if it's a large area that I'm painting. On damp paper, I find the paint goes on easier and the moisture on the paper gives me more time to lay that wash down because it's not going to dry really fast. Now, I usually paint with my paper flat rather than on an angle as well, but that's an entirely personal preference. Try painting on an angle, try painting flat, and just see which one you prefer. So this rectangle, I'm going to paint the flat wash on damp paper. Now my board is now flat on the table. I haven't got it on an angle anymore. So what I need to do is paint the shape with water first. Now when I put the water on, I paint it on carefully, just as I would put the paint on. So I try to paint it on evenly. I want it to be evenly wet all over, and I don't want puddles of water sitting anywhere. So I'm just spreading that water out, just making sure there's no puddles anywhere. Now I'll show you the water on the paper so that you can see it closer. So you can see that the paper is evenly covered with water. There's no puddles of water sitting anywhere, and there's a glossy sheen on the surface of the paper. So now I can put my paint on. So I'll use this bigger brush and I just start putting the paint on. Now because the paper is damp, I don't need to put the paint on so uniformly as I did on the dry paper. I can be a bit more random with where I place the brush. If I was painting on a full sheet of paper and I was painting a sky or some water, I'd probably use a flat brush, and I'd more than likely make my strokes more uniform. But for this small rectangle, I can be more random with my brush strokes. Now you might need to make your colour mix slightly darker than what you used on the dry paper, just to take into account the extra water that's on the paper. Now this water on the paper gives me more time to put the paint on. I'm more relaxed with the way I'm painting. Now I'm still trying to put the paint on as evenly as I was on the dry paper, because I don't want great puddles of paint forming anywhere. When I've got the colour on there, I check the shape and I make sure I haven't got any paint pooling anywhere in a darker puddle. And if I do, I can sop them up with my brush, just like I did on the dry paper. Okay, so I'll just get this last little bit in the corner, and then I'll let it sit and dry. I'll see what it looks like when it's dry. So I've just got it on time lapse here, and you can see that it's drying fairly evenly. When you're painting a flat wash on a painting, there will undoubtedly be areas or shapes that you don't want the wash on, and that means you have to paint around those shapes. So once you've practiced painting inside a square or a rectangle, and you're beginning to understand how to apply the wash, draw some shapes on your paper and practice painting around them. Okay, I'm just going to draw a random shape on my paper, and then I'll paint around it. I'll just give myself a few different angles to paint around as well. I'll quickly draw a rectangle around it so that I've got somewhere to stop. So just draw yourself a few shapes so that you can paint around them. Now I told you I prefer to paint my washes on damp paper, so I'm going to paint some water on the background first. Now I paint the water on carefully, as I said. I don't want any water on the shape, because if I do get water on there, then the paint will flow onto it. So I paint carefully around the shape, and then I just extend the water out to the edge of the rectangle. And when I've got that area covered with water, I can start to put some paint on there. Okay, so that's all covered with water. Now I can get the paint. I just paint it around the shape. And then when I get the edge of the shape in, I can put the paint on a bit quicker. Now, as I said earlier, the dampness of the paper allows me to take my time. When I'm painting on the damp paper, I feel I don't have to rush so much. When I'm painting on the dry paper, I'm always racing against the clock because I don't want the paint to dry, because if it dries, I'll get hard paint edges. So try this exercise yourself. Draw some shapes onto the paper, paint around them like this. Try it on the damp paper, but also try painting it on the dry paper and see what you prefer. You might find that you prefer to paint on the dry paper rather than the damp paper. So once I've got the area painted, then I can just use a damp brush just to sop up any puddles of paint that are sitting there. Okay, so as far as flat washes go, there's a few things to remember. Good quality cotton paper is important. Mix up enough paint so you don't run out. Use the biggest brush you're comfortable using. Don't fiddle with it when it's drying. Don't go back into the half-dry wash and try to fix something. Work quickly if you're painting on dry paper and reload your brush with paint regularly. Sop up any excess water and paint with a slightly damp brush and practice, practice, practice. Now, before I go, I want you to know that I don't use this flat wash technique very often in my paintings. I prefer my washes to have some variation in them just to make them more visually interesting. If you've done any of my tutorials, you'll know that I love to create deliberate watercolour blooms, and I rarely leave a wash, just one flat colour. But sometimes you need a flat wash somewhere in your painting just to provide some relief from the busier areas of the painting. And as a beginner, you need to know how to do this so that you can begin to understand how watercolour behaves. Once you can master this flat wash technique, then it's going to be easier for you to be able to move on to the other two washes and to be able to manipulate the paint to suit your needs. I'll show you the other two washes in future videos. Okay, if you found this video useful, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and click that little bell so that you get notified each time I post a new tutorial. Thanks guys, have fun with your painting, make sure you practice, and I'll see you soon. Squares or rectangles on your paper and paint flat washes and paint flat washes inside a square or a rectangle or a aura. Don't go back into the wash and try to fix something. I need a drink. I'm thirsty. Just a minute.